And then, of course, when it comes to, where does the money come from? Well, that's the classic case of, the United Kingdom being the monopoly issuer of the currency, and they have the capacity to credit accounts at will. And the question isn't the money. The issue here is how we spend that money. That's a really big point of democracy. It's about discussing how you want to shape society, not just through where the money comes from, but through the very resources around us and how it benefits the individual and our local community.
We don't need to have involuntary unemployment in Scotland, in an independent Scotland, in anywhere in the UK with a free-floating fiat currency. This is what we're really trying to get across on the paper. It's so much healthier if we take the precarity out of our society.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard Cameron Archibald and Kairin Van Sweeden of Modern Money Scotland. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to them about their proposal for a job guarantee for an independent Scotland. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction. But if you want to dive in here, the context is that if you live in a country with a floating exchange rate currency, like say the UK, the US, Japan, Canada, or Australia, your government is unequivocally the source of your national currency. And this means that your government is fully responsible for the level of spending power in your economy. Every year, they spend some money into the economy, and over the same period of time, they tax some money out of the economy. When they do the accounting at the end of that period, if it turns out that they've spent more into the economy than they've taxed out of the economy, we say that they've run a deficit. But that deficit, those pounds, dollars, or yen they've spent into the economy, represent net financial assets for you and me, aka the private sector. Put simply, it's our money. And we talk a little in this conversation about how we need to understand that in order to be able to fight for progressive policies, and how misleading and damaging it is when pundits and politicians characterize government deficits as being somehow immoral rather than just a piece of accounting. By accounting identity, every sector's deficit represents another sector's surplus, and the government's deficit is the non-government's surplus. When the government runs a surplus, it's you and me, the non-government, that has to go into deficit to offset it. Anyone with a credit card knows that the private sector can run deficits, but we also know that for us, default is possible and even probable if we keep having to go into debt to offset government surpluses. On the other hand, as the issuer of currency, your government can never involuntarily default on any future promise to pay any amount of its own currency, because it issues that currency without operational limit. So, if there's not enough spending power in the economy to give a job and an income to everybody who wants one, that's solely to do with government policy. And this is what we mean when we say that unemployment is a policy choice, and a bad one that can be fixed with the stroke of a pen. And so, in order to have all economic policy options on the table, a nation that aims to have self-determination needs to control its own currency, and the conversation that follows is all about that. In the show notes for this episode, among other resources, I've linked to Kairin and Cameron's job guarantee proposal and a few of our other episodes to do with Scottish independence, and to some other things that came up in the conversation. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month, which is 71 British pence at the time of recording. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are delighted to welcome to the MMT podcast the executive directors of Modern Money Scotland and authors of a new paper detailing a job guarantee for an independent Scotland. Joining us, we have Kairin Van Sweeden and Cameron Archibald. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Hi.
So we'll get onto the paper in a minute, but first let's do the origin stories. Kairin, can you tell us how you first came to MMT?
So I first started trying to learn about economics in the middle of 2018. At that time in Scotland, in the independence movement, there was a lot of disquiet about a paper that the Scottish National Party had published called the Sustainable Growth Commission. And I didn't really understand the disquiet, so I felt very ignorant about macroeconomics. And also at the same time, I had people round about me. I was in Leith SNP at that time, saying that I should stand to be a councillor. And I thought, well, if I'm going to take on that kind of responsibility, I really need to understand macroeconomics a lot more. So I started listening to your podcasts, and that was my first entry to MMT. And it's kind of gone much bigger than that. So obviously after that, I got into reading papers, got the books, I got the audiobooks. So I just spend a lot of my spare time learning about macroeconomics now.
Obviously, you have quite a prominent role within the SNP. Did MMT have some influence on your position with regards to Scottish independence, first of all, and maybe with regards to the currency?
Okay, so my position on Scottish independence is that Scotland should be independent, but learning about how the currency works has really made it more urgent for me to also teach other people about that, because a lot of people in the independence movement don't understand this, and I actually think that it's not that complicated just when you start really thinking about the plumbing of money. And you'll know that the Gower Initiative also just published a paper not long ago about really the plumbing of money in the UK. So I've listened to that and read that, and I can explain that, I think, fairly simply to people.
Oh, good, because that's the weird thing about that whole thing is, obviously we go out there and we go, look, it's kind of evident. It's called fiat currency. You know what that means, right? It comes from the government. It's not dug out of the ground. It's the government going, make it so. Now that's money. And people still, talk about, well, I don't quite believe it. I want to see the plumbing. So then the authors of that paper go out and they do the work. They really take apart the plumbing. And then the reaction from some people is, oh, that's too complicated. And it's like, well, make up your mind, because it's a bit like if you ever saw Fight Club.
Yeah,
there was a bit where people have to stand outside their house for 2 days if they want to get into Fight Club. And Tyler Durden says, okay, if the person's slightly, overweight, tell him he's too fat to come in. Or if they're underweight, tell him he's too skinny. Or, just whatever you do, find something and don't let him in. And it seems to be that's the approach people take with MMT. They're like, oh, that's too simple. You've oversimplified it. And then you go, okay, right, you want to see the guts? Here's the guts. And then they go, oh, that's too complicated.
For me, I've been a teacher for a long time. So, I think it also comes down to placing examples into people's worlds. So I've spoken to a couple of people in my role on the Policy Development Committee about this, people who have ideas for, how they would like to see an independent Scotland, but perhaps also things that they'd like to see differently while we're in a devolved situation and where we still remain a currency user. So when I put it to them that, think about the idea of the currency not being your constraint, how would you then, if you had the money that you needed to do this, then what would be the constraints after that? So, I've spoken to a teacher about this, I've spoken to a smallholder about this. And when you start to get them to think about the real resources, then they understand the role of currency. And especially if they see it in the context of something that they have a personal ambition about.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Cameron, how did you first discover MMT?
I think if I had to guess or remember, I think I was back at the beginning of university. I took economics as one of my first 3 modules I wanted to kind of study along with politics and history. And at the time, there was this debate in Scotland called the Jurors Debate. The JER stands for the Government Expenditure Revenue Scotland, which is like an economic report that talks about Scotland's kind of deficit and overall economy compared to the rest of the UK. And it's used quite a lot to discuss like the scenario of what would this mean if Scotland became an independent country. Now, of course, obviously it shows Scotland having a massive deficit. And every year you used to go, look, Scotland's got a massive deficit. It's bad news for the nationalists, and the nationalists go, but that deficit belongs to the unionists. It's their fault. Therefore, if we're independent, we can do things differently. So when I took economics, a big part was for me to try and tackle that argument. How can we bring down the deficit? How can we really go for kind of a surplus, anti-national government sort of model? And then very quick, I remember going back, citing New Zealand as an example of going for these government surpluses, and then how quickly that changed for me going, no. The deficit must be big. We can't be like New Zealand. So it's incredible. I took a massive U-turn from the beginning of that module to the end of that module. I think a big part was Richard Murphy, because Richard Murphy himself randomly jumped into the debate on JERS and said that the data was rubbish. And when he was discussing the quality of the data, I then started kind of following his work and his kind of comments on MMT. And I think it just started kind of going down MMT route. And I think the stock flow consistent model was where it really showed me the mirroring effect, where when you look at the government sector, or the government spending, how it mirrors to private sector assets and the assets of ourselves, the money in our pockets, it really puts perspective of what that deficit actually represents. So I think that's how I roughly started. So I began at university, where I was very much a deficit hawk. I think that's the term Stephanie Kelton uses, and now I'm very much an MMT owl, where I'm now constantly the complete opposite I was at the beginning of first year.
Yeah. Well, at least the hawk position, even Stephanie says that the hawk position makes sense. If you think about money, as a lot of people do, and use the household metaphor, then, the government's going into debt. We've got to pay it back. It's terrible. It's immoral and all of that. It's the deficit dove position that really sort of doesn't make any sense. That they, deficits, they're all right sometimes, but it'll have to be paid back. And it's like, is it though?
We can spend as long as interest rates are low.
Yeah, all that.
It seems to be more like the result of a political negotiation as opposed to a kind of scientific study.
Yeah, it's trying to meet the middle ground, really, and trying to show, we're not like those heartless conservatives who think that economically smart. We're also smart, but just, we're also take economics seriously. But, then MMT came along and ruined the fun for everyone, didn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it is the classic centrist position, isn't it? It's like we're totally different to conservatives, just not in that way or that way or that way or that way.
We'll just ruin people's lives sometimes, not all the time, sometimes.
Yeah. Let's get on to the job guarantee paper. I don't know who wants to start, but just tell us all about it. Start anywhere.
Should I go for macroeconomic or should I go for history first? I'll go for history, because I think for me, the big thing that started the job guarantee actually began when I looked at an SNP leaflet from 1965. And it was one of my my grandfather was a friend of an SNP MP, and on his flyer, he had the phrase, the SNP in Independent Scotland in the 60s would have full employment. And for me at the time, I thought, wow, full employment, trying to get everyone employed. That sounds really fascinating. And I looked into the phrase, and I fell in a loophole where full employment didn't actually really mean fully employing everyone. And it actually just kind of meant trying to build up aggregate demand, effectively. Where I ultimately found the concept of the job guarantee, I think this is the big important part, because I think she's really not spoken enough, is Sadie Tanner Mosel Alexander. Now, if anyone doesn't know her, she was America's first black woman economist. She got her PhD in the 1920s. And when I was 1920s or 1930s, I can't remember the specific date, but she basically was the first black woman in America to get her PhD in in economics. And she was also one of the first individuals, or the first individual in terms of the modern concept of it, to push forward a job guarantee. And for her, this is really important for various reasons. It was ultimately about trying to build interracial class alliances amongst the American people to try and take on the vile aspects of needs and wants within an American society. And that we're talking about mass waves of prejudice, mass waves of economic discrimination towards the most vulnerable. We talk about not just the poor, but also the ethnic minorities within America as well, and also the depravity created from the recession of 1928. For her, we talk about the job guarantee, talk about Martin Luther King pushing it in the Randolph Institute paper, which is true. The civil rights movement were a massive big part of it, but it actually began with her. And I think it's really important we scream her name out, because I think she made a really, really great point. I think something like discrimination in employment is largely down to race. It's partly down to religion as well. And it's an abuse and a denial of freedom itself, of freedom of religion and freedom of speech, because we see employment as an action within our community about building the sort of community we want to see. So, as we go on to the future, after she worked on that proposal, she actually worked for the Truman government after 1945, and which is incredible, because who would think that these black academics were actually working for the president himself to work on tackling discrimination. And what you'll notice is that progressive economists, when they talk about creating a job guarantee, they'll talk about how it needs to be a fundamental guarantee. Everyone should have the provision of a job when at a need. And this was all the way down to kind of ethnic minority group talking about this right. But when it came to white policymakers, they kind of went, can we compromise by having kind of increased aggregate demand instead? So it was always this constant fight back from policymakers who were largely in a very privileged position, who kind of had this kind of slightly orthodox, Keynesian, but compared to the civil rights movement, somewhat orthodox view on creating a job guarantee, whilst the civil rights movement was screaming for this to be a right. Now, it did become a right. It was under Article 23 of the Declaration of Human Rights. And yet, to this very day, it's still not really seen as an actual human right, because we don't see it from a universal perspective as an actual service. So I think that's where I kind of was really inspired by it, because to this very day, you'd think this basic right should become a service, as to health, to the National Health Service. But yet here we are. Very few developed countries in the world actually take it seriously. Although in the paper we do go on to kind of discuss examples of which were kind of close to it. So I think that's where I would personally start off with it. Really, Sadie Alexander was just kind of a large inspiration towards it as well. But widely, the civil rights movement. And I think once we see it from a human rights perspective, that's where you can really begin the importance of it from a social aspect, but also then you move on to the economic aspect of why it brings the stability it does to developed countries, and also to developing countries too.
So to go a little bit before all this, just stepping back to 2014, just for a moment. At the time, there was one of the key discussions of the Scottish referendum was the currency, and it seemed to be a place where the SNP wasn't quite comfortable discussing it, and what the plans would be. And there was talk about retaining the pound, then and that became, I think, one of the key issues at the time. So, how far has the SNP come? Do they understand that, for example, to have something like the job guarantee, like this proposal, that they would need their own currency, or is there still work to be done on that front?
Clearly, the leadership at the moment don't talk about this, and I think they're getting very orthodox economic advice about this as well. So, and also there's a lot of people within not just the Scottish National Party, but within the other independent supporting parties, and people who are in the Yes movement and don't want to be in political parties, don't yet understand the importance of having our own currency to be independent, and that, using a foreign country's currency is really going to make us dependent. So it's a job that we have to do within the movement first and foremost, because I don't think we're going to convince people. In fact, I know we're not going to convince people who are not yet over to the idea of Scotland being an independent country unless the macroeconomic case is laid out very clearly for them.
I think as well, back in 2014, I was 17, so I just kind of blindly followed.
All right, get over yourself, mate.
Hey, I'm about to out myself here. Okay, I blindly followed Alex Salmond's cry for the pound, because back then I thought, yeah, we could just keep the pound. It's fine. We can have the good things. But looking back, I was like, my goodness, how could I come to that conclusion? But 17, I can excuse myself, throwing my age in there again. Sorry, but I think the interesting thing, as Kairin touched on, it is true. The SNP leadership did heavily go on to kind of follow the orthodoxy of Andrew Wilson, who was one of the big authors of the Growth Commission, which is what they followed. But before that, actually, I was in talks with trying to get Keith Brown, who's the deputy leader of the Scottish National Party, to try and meet up with the likes of Bill Mitchell and Warren Mosler, and I think also Roland Gray as well, are a group of MMT economists. And we were actually in a free discussions, quite happily getting along with it. To try and arrange this to happen, and we were about to make this happen, and there was email correspondence and Twitter DMs, and then when the actual Growth Commission was released, and it was very clear that the SNP decided that they're going to maintain sterling for the formidable future, as the report suggested, 10 years, the communication kind of just dropped, basically, and that's when the SNP really held the hard line of, we need to keep the pound for the kind of the medium term. Now, that obviously, that kind of very hard attitude was not hugely welcomed by a lot of the grassroots, because at the time there was a lot of positivity towards the new currency. There was 2 Yes national events which had all the independence group branches come together to discuss the economics, and on two occasions they both endorsed having their own currency. So when the SNP had this kind of approach, it was a bit of a surprise, and because a lot of most of the SNP people at these ES events were SNP members. So myself and my colleague Timothy Ryder, we both put forward an amendment, a small amendment. We wish it could be bigger, but to take down the entire Growth Commission would require, I don't know, like a Bible essentially, because a lot of it is just nonsense. But we put forward an amendment to try and tweak it, and one of it was to get rid of the mechanisms, which was called the 6 tests, and these 6 tests were akin to kind of Gordon Brown's tests for joining the euro, which were, i.e., designed not to join the euro. And these 6 tests for the SNP were designed to basically not create a Scottish currency. And we also put forward in our amendment was to create a Scottish currency as soon as possible. That was Amendment D, and there was a similar amendment called Amendment B, which basically completely scrapped the tests entirely. Amendment D got rid of them from the central bank actually running them as policy, whereas Amendment D just got rid of it entirely as a concept. Amendment B didn't get through, but Amendment D did. And just before Amendment D happened as well, the SNP compromised, or the SNP leadership compromised, and said there would be a new currency vote within the first term of a Scottish Parliament, so between 1 to 5 years. After that, though, it gets a little tricky, because the 6 tests, which were to dictate if there would be a new Scottish currency, whilst they would not be a central bank operation, they wouldn't be tested by staff at the central bank of a newly formed independent Scotland, it would still be used as a template for the party to kind of judge for themselves. But then under a PR system, though, if the SNP are only using it in the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Greens and Labour and other parties who want a new currency could just ignore those 6 tests and make their own judgment calls if they vote for it. So where are we now? Good question, because it's still heatedly debated, and people, I think, in the party want a very more clear line. The official line is, putting all the pieces together, there will be a new currency within an independent Scotland between 1 to 5 years if the Scottish Parliament votes for it. And within 1 to 5 years, the institutions of a central bank can be formed, and this would include trying to build the foreign exchange reserves. This would include trying to build the actual institutions like technology for a central bank. But these things can be done if the EU can do it within a matter of years, dealing with various IT databases with dozens of different languages and literally millions of different bank accounts. And it's pretty not straightforward, but it's a realistic assumption that this can be done within a 1 to 5 year timescale. So that's where the S&P policy is officially. Could it be clearer? I wish it was more dedicated to a new currency, but that's sort of where we are just now.
Can I just jump in here first of all and just say, that first of all, the S&P it's a party, it's a collective, it's quite it's a broad church as it has to be. So there are different thoughts with all the members. They've got different ideas, and the members obviously include the people that are in leadership positions as well. So it's a lot of people just don't even want to look at economics. They're not interested in that. Some people are much more interested in things like the Constitution, for example, much more legal aspects of independence, which I'm not interested in really as much as they are. I'm interested in the economics. So at the amendment that Cameron and Tim put through, there was, for their amendment, 480 people voted for it and 420 people voted against. So their amendment won that, but the 6 tests were still kept in. So you've got a mixed situation where we're going to get a currency as soon as practicable, but we've still voted for the 6 tests. Those two things are opposing each other, really. But we're just going to have to work that out. And, me and Cameron's job to a great extent, and the people within Modern Money Scotland, is just to try and convince people that we need to get our own currency as quickly as possible. And, it's not going to be that complicated to set it up. Other people have done it. It's not rocket science. Okay.
Well, given that that's the mission, what's the, most, succinct way to say it, why it's important, to have your own currency, or monetary sovereignty, as we call it in MMT land?
Well, we don't have monetary sovereignty right now, and we haven't had monetary sovereignty since the Act of Union in 1707. So, that has had a particular effect on Scotland. I would say that there hasn't been enough deficit spending, and I would say that after living 8 years in London and 5 years in the Netherlands, it was very obvious to me that that's the case. So in order to, mobilise your population to do the things that your country needs to do, you need to be in charge of your currency. For me, the currency fundamentally is a policy tool. And again, going back to talking to people about how do you see an independent Scotland? Okay, so if money wasn't the problem, what would be the real resource problem that you would maybe think would stop your idea for an independent Scotland, your particular area of knowledge? How do you see, what are the problems with the real resources? So getting people to think about real resources. And I've been talking to some journalists in Scotland as well, and getting them to try and stop talking about where are we going to find the money, how are we going to find the money, and getting them to talk about real resources, because that's really what we want to get people to think about, not just in Scotland, but obviously everywhere,
I think another thing is the Jurors Debate itself is really unhealthy, because when a lot of independent supporters talk about jurors, they want to discuss how it's not our deficit. But kind of the natural defence of that is to suggest that a deficit is bad. And really, if the opposition are saying independent Scotland will have a big deficit, then my response to that is going, great, that's fantastic. That is that extra investment going in to support the money in our pockets, to then increase the kind of private assets we all have, and to actually maintain a healthy lifestyle, to pay down our private debts and help pay our mortgages, and help kind of just have a comfortable lifestyle. But because Jurors is about kind of portraying a deficit in a bad light, it's trying to escape that mentality. And because it happens every single year, trying to change the attitude every single year, saying, actually, let's stop talking about Jurors and the deficit being bad. Let's discuss what that deficit does for independent Scotland. What is the outcome of it? How can that deficit be spent? And then, of course, when it comes to, where does the money come from? Well, that's the classic case of, the United Kingdom and monetary sovereign countries as a whole being the monopoly issuer of the currency, and they have the capacity to credit accounts at will. And as the GIMS report says, when it comes to spending, it comes from the Consolidated Fund, which starts every day at a cash balance of zero. Literally, it's a credit accounting every single day, And the question is, as Kairin rightly points out, the question isn't the money, especially if you look at the global pandemic. Money isn't the problem here. The issue here is the institutional power, the balance of it, and how we spend that money, and how we can hold those accountable if they're spending it in the right way. And also resources. The resources are the key aspect so we don't overheat the economy. But it's also a healthy discussion, because once you discuss resources and how they're redistributed, that's a really big point of democracy. It's about discussing how you want to shape society, not just through where the money comes from, but through the very resources around us and how it benefits the individual and our local community.
So to go back to something Kairin mentioned, when it comes to these 6 tests, they were proposed, if I'm not mistaken, by the Sustainable Growth Commission. Who are they, and why are these six tests bad or kind of contradictory to the having of your own currency?
Cameron will remember the 6 tests off by heart better than I will, but the Sustainable Growth Commission was written by some members of the SNP and some people that they consulted as well. So that's fundamentally how it came about. It didn't come about really, I would like to see a much broader research of the membership to see their thoughts about how they want to see Scotland go forward as an independent country. But Cameron would go into the 6 tests better than I can.
I can read them out for you if you want.
I think I remember them. So I think the first one is fiscal sustainability.
The deficit and debt test, yeah.
The second one is around the credibility of the central bank and issuing debt. Third one is it financial requirements or something along those lines?
It says, does it meet the needs of people and business?
Okay, the fourth one is around foreign reserves and financial reserves.
Yeah.
Fifth one, trade investment.
Trade patterns.
Okay, last one, I think, is on the trade cycle as a whole.
Have we decoupled from the UK business cycle?
Whew, okay, I still roughly get them in my head. Okay, I slightly passed the test. So,
so Carol, we absolutely didn't get you on here to do a comprehension test.
Okay. So to go over roughly the 6 tests, I think there's actually a video on YouTube which I recommend people watch of Timothy Rideout just going on conference stage and just completely destroying these tests.
Yeah, he demolishes it, doesn't he?
He demolishes it so great, and it's fantastic. But to the top of my head, basically, the first one on the sustainability of fiscal spending, that's around this kind of created concept that the best way to deficit spend is sticking to that 3% GDP ratio and the 50% GDP ratio. Now, why have that deficit ratio to small numbers? Because that just seems to be the kind of classic neoliberal target. There's no actual macro sense to it whatsoever, and it wouldn't make any macro sense whatsoever because countries are in different financial situations. The deficit ratio and the GDP and the debt ratio to GDP should reflect the needs of the country. So if your deficit should be 5% or 10%, then that's what it should be. If you need a 10% ratio to deficit to GDP, but you're limited to 3%, then you're giving yourself a 3%, 7% real terms cut there. And that's what we're talking about with austerity. And you're hurting regular people because you're basically pandering to markets, essentially. That's what it ultimately comes down to. Market stability, we know in actual fact, and anyone who reads Stephanie Killen's The Deficit Myth will know, is the government essentially sets what market rates are. So trying to create this idea of fiscal sustainability by trying to have these ratios low is just nonsense. We could be here all day discussing that.
Yeah, you're not even pandering to the market, are you?
Well, no, you're just pandering. Basically, you're pandering to you're pandering to pals in high finance, and also you're just following classical bad advice, essentially. So when you actually give yourself austerity measures, it's not fiscal sustainability; it's fiscal punishment for the sake of just an outdated ideology. Now, when it comes to central bank credibility, how can you, the most obvious point is, how do you measure that if you don't have a central bank? How does that even make any sense whatsoever?
Yeah.
Have your central bank walk down the street and see how many other central banks high five your central bank.
It's so bizarre. Like, I think Tim was like, what does this even, like, some of this stuff, what do they even mean? Some of it? And the funny thing is, when the SNP has a policy of joining the EU, which, that's a bigger debate within itself, but if you want to join the EU, one of the chapters of the Quiz actually make clear that you need to have some form of price stability, and that will largely come down to having your own central bank. I'm pretty sure, I think the actual thing, I've got it here actually, I've just brought up just now, it says, quote, economic and monetary policy contains specific rules requiring the independence of central banks in member states. Now, the independence of your actual banks, which we would not have because we're relying on a bank which we are not actually in control of, and that would require some sort of communication, but that's not actually a model that exists within the EU. It's quite a ludicrous situation the SNP put themselves in, whereas if you just had your own central bank, you would have that price stability in the first place to reflect policy to create that stability. So the whole thing is just bizarre. When it comes to financial requirements in regards to mortgages and liabilities, I think that comes to a longer discussion in terms of how you actually create it. So to save time here, I think I'd refer to Warren Mosler in terms of how you introduce your own currency, moving away from the euro, which effectively is you let people opt in for the new currency, and over time you kind of let an appreciation bias occur, because people will slowly have to accumulate the new currency in order then to pay down liabilities, and that will increase over time, whilst cancelled out by other forms of taxation and other liabilities. So there's that. That goes to the whole bigger discussion, but I'll leave it there just now. But that's possible. When it comes to foreign reserves, again, that's not straightforward. There's nothing exists that's straightforward in macroeconomics. But essentially, if Scotland's going to measure countries similar to its size, so probably around 5% of GDP, which is roughly what the UK has right now, we're talking about foreign reserves between 11 to 14 billion. But how that's covered can occur in various ways. You can talk about the sterling that's already in circulation just now. You can do asset swaps. You can come to agreement of borrowing, but obviously real terms borrowing in a foreign currency, MMT is obviously largely against, so I would not recommend that. But I think over time, though, the accumulation of excess currency can be occurrent. That would depend on trade policy as well. But these things can happen. And when we're talking about a fiat currency that floats, you're not going to be heavily reliant on your foreign reserves, because if you have a floating currency, you're not going to be defending against the peg. And therefore, that's going to really be there for liquidity reasons for financial markets. So, how we view foreign exchange reserves are actually quite different from what Andrew Wilson wrote in his report. Now, when it comes to trade investment patterns, this comes from, what's that actually mean? What does that mean?
It's very vague.
It's incredibly vague. Like, I don't really know where to begin there. Like, if you want to escape, I mean, this kind of relates to the kind of trade cycle as well. If you want to escape the kind of the UK model in terms of trade, so if the SNP wants to be kind of more international and adopt the kind of EU market, how are you going to do that by coupling your currency to the same market you were trying to leave? I mean, absolutely no sense. I mean, I don't really know where to kind of take the angle here. I mean,
I think what they mean, perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, but does it mean basically is this exchange rate favorable?
Yeah.
It's really difficult to imagine that the pound, exchange rate would be even more favorable than just having your own.
I mean, if it's investment patterns, it could be referring to yields. And I guess for the sake of just the easiest example you can look to is Japan, which, because, Stephanie cites it as well, actually, when you look at Japan, they have almost complete control of the yields because, their deficit and debt ratios are like some of the biggest in the developed world. I think what's Japan like? 2.5 quadrillion yen in debt, and yet their yields and inflation rates are incredibly low because, when you're swapping different assets between bond bidders and the central bank, what you're actually doing is creating a savings account. And ultimately, bond bidders have faith in the central bank. Now, how would bond bidders have a faith in a Scottish central bank if that central bank isn't actually independent? It's somewhere in another country with different monetary framework that is focused on the rest of the UK and not Scotland if there's different needs. So obviously, if you look to Greece, for example, bond bidders had yields that were insane because they wanted a return and they wanted a punishing return. So we don't want to be in that weird. So, if you want to escape that kind of cuckold model away from the UK, you have to have your own currency, and you have to make sure you can set these yield rates effectively for the short term, which in turn makes for the long term. So the 6 tests are just bizarre, but they're meant to be bizarre. They're meant to be ridiculous because they're meant to stop a new currency, and it's absolutely bizarre. And I honestly, it baffles me. And when I've spoken to Warren and Bill and even Roland Gray and others, it's just baffling. It's frustrating. Trust me, I've had these rants before.
It's great to get you on for an old school rant.
My friends won't hear it.
Classic old school 6 test rant.
Sorry, I triggered that.
Oh no, it's fine. It feels good to get out.
I think the oldies are the goodies, but it goes to, I think, macroeconomic professionals, this is a mark of how little they understand monetary operations, that they're just like, we got to say something. We got to put some numbers out there and sound really serious about it. So 3% sounds about right. Bill Mitchell described it a few years ago as that all the macroeconomists got ratio fever.
Yeah.
And they were all just throwing around different ratios. Yeah. And none of them really get into the heart of like what money is, where it comes from. And just like Kairin said very clearly, it's a policy tool.
Exactly. Yes.
It moves resources around. It's a utility. And unfortunately, the victims of that misunderstanding don't really have a voice. And,
Yeah, and the other thing as well, the reason we started Modern Money Scotland as well is because with the onset of the pandemic, and we'd just gone through the 2019 election, and the red wall had been smashed down by the Conservatives. And I listened to Lisa Nandy talk. She was on Andrew Marr, and she was talking about how she'd spoken to this little old lady, and the little old lady had said, I really like the Labour manifesto, but I don't want my grandchildren to pay. And I'm sort of screaming at the television going, no. And then a couple of weeks into the pandemic, I started to hear the mainstream media say, well, we're just going to have some more post-pandemic austerity. And I just thought, no, I have to do something about this. So I contacted all the other guys and we had a chat about it. And I said, we need to form some sort of pressure group, some sort of body. And that was why Modern Money Scotland came about, was really the fear that the Westminster government will try and impose austerity upon us again post-pandemic. And we know that is not okay in any way. I mean, I read a book called The Violence of Austerity, written by a couple of academics from Sheffield. It's horrific. How many people have died and how many people have continued to die because they gamed this pandemic and decided not to do the deficit spending. So the death continues through that lack of deficit spending. And we have to shout out about that and say, no, we're not going to put up with this any longer.
And it also seems amazing, if you agree, I don't know if you agree with me, but that they think that actually the austerity that came before COVID-19 made the country somewhat more prepared to handle COVID, when the reality is the opposite, right? The lack of investment has actually weakened us.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, great. All that money you've saved. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Oh, great. Let's put that into action now, shall we? Nah.
Yeah.
No, because inflation.
Yeah.
But talking about inflation, you do a really good job in the paper, your job guarantee paper. You tackle the sort of what about inflation question head on, and you write, inflation should not be automatically addressed through increased taxation, because as we understand, taxation regulates aggregate demand. Then you go on to write, other causes of inflation include businesses passing on their costs or increasing their profit margins. Speculation on commodities is another source of inflation. To tackle the pricing power of large businesses, other tools must be used to support the public purpose, such as regulation of businesses' pricing power or creating new price indices. Now, would you mind, for the geeky people out there, talking first about how speculation on commodities causes inflation?
Kieran, actually, remind me before I go on, who's the Scottish economist who wrote Angry Economics again. I thought maybe
it's Mark Blythe.
Mark Blythe, yeah. So I remember he was giving a presentation at the University of Stirling, and I was sitting there. And ironically enough, this is a point where he actually did not like MMT. And a few months later, he'd go on to discuss with Stephanie Kelton, and now he's a bit more in the sense, a bit more kindly towards MMT. But one of the big things he pointed out was that a lot of Conservatives will, when it comes to discussing inflation, the minute there's no actual real terms inflation, they will turn to kind of asset inflation. So we're talking like kind of illiquid sources such as like housing or like more physical resources. They go, oh look, asset inflation, and I think then Mark Blythe screamed, but this is not inflation, and basically stressed the point that this has limited real terms effect in the overall macro economy. So I think, and also Bill Mitchell makes a really good point. So what you'll have is, and I think this is when it came to like having a foreign investment review board essentially, is people with a lot of excess wealth, what we'll do is they will buy up real terms resources, usually physical resources, illiquid resources. From a very simplistic perspective, see it as a flat. I'm actually moving to a flat at the end of this month. And, I'm actually getting a very good deal from my landlord. But if my landlord had excess wealth and decided he really wanted to make money out of it, what he could do was he could not give away that rentier. He can actually decide to wait until the market itself is prepared to sell it off for a higher price, in which case then he can make more money out of it. And this could mean it could be leave accommodation unused for up to a year, maybe a couple of years entirely. And this actually has a very negative impact in certain districts, especially at the west of England, actually, the sort of like green districts where you have all wealthy individuals who kind of buy out a lot of property and never actually use it. So in this circumstance here, this is where when you create this kind of speculative competitive framework, in which case then you have these resources being completely unused when actually you put it to productive use when wealthy individuals sell it off to probably higher bidders who are already wealthy themselves, and basically have individuals, basically it's the wealthiest shaking hands and sharing assets, whereas working people at the bottom end can't actually afford to find a house and and that creates a sort of brain drain, because then they're moving out to try and find affordable housing elsewhere. But of course, when they look elsewhere, you probably find the same effect in other areas going about. Or in my case, for example, when I was originally looking for affordable housing, I'm lucky to be in Stirling, for example, because we actually have, it's actually one of the lowest in the country because of this student kind of body. But originally, though, when I was looking for affordable housing, I had to look to a lot of areas which were a lot more underinvested, effectively. So the speculative body really comes down to a large financial elite who are already wealthy, trying to build up already excess wealth. And in the paper, we kind of discussed the fact that, a lot of people who look at MMT go, yes, well, to address these inflationary issues, you wouldn't raise taxes, though, because you're MMTers. You think taxes don't do anything. Well, we make the point that actually, yes, taxes don't actually pay for anything, technically speaking, but they give the redistributive power by taking the excess wealth away from individuals to use it for speculation and also for lobbying, as well, as we slightly touch on as well. And it then helps other individuals then have a stake within the market and gives them that chance to, if the community as a whole want to use this land or real assets for communitative good, they can do that. So that's kind of how we kind of touched on inflation and taxation in our paper. Inflation is not the danger it's perceived to be, but it can be. And if so, it's done from various different angles, not because the government spends too much, although that could be a risk in the future, but because actually wealthy individuals have the wealth to create these issues. And therefore, the government should set taxations at levels which create a redistributive effect that support democracy, but overall support macroeconomic stability.
With regards to the job guarantee and the paper you wrote, has there been any surveys in Scotland about how well received the policy is? And can you give us maybe a bit of context with regards to the levels of unemployment in Scotland at the moment?
In terms of surveys, there's only one YouGov poll I can come off the top of my head, and that was in 2020. in April. And now this was a UK-wide one, but actually it was almost the exact same result. So in the UK-wide, 72% of people supported having a job guarantee overall, and in Scotland it was slightly higher at 74%, but that was a smaller sample, obviously, within the wider poll. But that's a legit poll, though. It was over 1,000 people that were surveyed, and it's actually quite fascinating because, I tried to look up kind of previous surveys on the job guarantee before, and, there's not a lot out there. When the policy kind of pops up to voters, they go, yeah, we like this. It's quite a good indication that this is worth going forward. In regards to unemployment in Scotland right now, I need to remember exactly because there's a few figures here. I can give you a few examples. First of all, I know there are women, for example, are 25% of women in Scotland are economically inactive. I know when you consider real terms unemployment, and that's also those who are underemployed, so people who are employed in the sector for work, but it's not the sector they wish to work in, they probably want to work more or less hours. We are talking at least over 100,000 people are in real terms unemployment in Scotland. When it comes to ethnic minorities, you're also twice as likely to be unemployed. There are obviously various reasons why that is. The Scottish government haven't done, at least from what I'm aware, haven't done a study into the sources of these unemployment, but there are obviously a lot of behavioural studies into this, and that's actually what we're going to be focusing on part 2 of the job guarantee paper. So we'll begin this by doing an audit on the kind of sources of unemployment, looking from the job provider, the employer, and the job seeker. And a lot of that comes down to real opportunities and the structural environment. So surplus labour obviously is one of the big issues here, and those who are in surplus labour are those who are employed last and unemployed first. That's actually, and Kairin actually really helped there actually when it came to the employment paper when kind of trying to hit on that angle. So when you talk about real unemployment, though, it's shocking because the UK government uses a definition which includes people who are economically active but are miserable at the job they look at, and therefore they can go, oh look, unemployment is only 3 or 2%. Aren't we just fabulously economically prosperous? Whereas you'll have someone maybe working in a dead-end job, having low hours, low pay, and struggling to actually have any sort of cash in pocket at the end of this month, completely miserable. And when they see that figure of, unemployment at 2%, what does that actually mean for them? What kind of faith do they get? Whilst the people down in kind of our government are swinging wine, talking about meeting these small targets, real working people, on the other hand, aren't actually in employment they seek. So when we talk about unemployment, it's really important that we try and take a wider definition, which includes those who are economically active but are not meeting the kind of satisfaction which we should be meeting for our normal lives.
It's not even of course they massage the statistics, but they're looking at the wrong numbers, aren't they, all the time? And deliberately so. They're probably the kind of people who go, I've got 3,000 Facebook friends. That means I've got 3,000 friends. And so you do a great move, you guys, in the paper, which I really wanted to just underline. I'm going to quote, critics of full employment policies argue that it would create unsustainable levels of inflation. However, even the strongest opponents of heterodox economic thinking, such as the Cato Institute, accept this is not accurate. The Cato Institute carried out a study into every single case of hyperinflation in world history and found none were attributed to states seeking full employment. They concluded that driving factors included war, political mismanagement, and the transition from a command to a market-based economy. And I think that's great. I think
I won this paper.
Exactly. When you can rely on a sort of right-wing think tank to make your argument, I think that's pretty good.
When you actually look at opponents of MMT, they will always try and put, especially those who are kind of the neo-Keynesian side, a lot of them will always put up a really tough talk on how the data or the inaccuracy of the theory, I say theory in quotation marks, is more of just an actual science of it, is incorrect. And then they themselves will go on to actually make similar arguments themselves. The only difference is maybe a tweak of language, or maybe they're basing these arguments on a false principle but reaching similar conclusions, or maybe the other way around. If it wasn't for Kairin, who came in to help with this paper, there's so many angles in this paper we would not have touched on. I'm absolutely grateful for the way she's essentially saved it, because when I wrote the paper, I was quite proud of it, but Kairin really helped give it the language and angle which needed to really almost perfect what our message really is. And it's whilst the macroeconomic argument is important, it's about trying to bring it down to the human element, which is we're trying to improve the lives of our community and individuals and ourselves, and making macroeconomics not that controls our lifestyles, but we control the policy framework of macroeconomics to benefit ourselves and our community.
I should say that I don't know if you saw, I did a little article to sort of go along with it as well. I've set up a blog. I try and put it in a Scottish context because I was reading a book that my dad had by a guy called Matt McGinn. He was a folk singer in Glasgow and a real socialist. And he was talking about when he was during the Second World War, he was about 13 years old. And he was talking about how the guys round about him were, sometimes there were people unemployed round about him. But when the war came, suddenly there was no such thing as unemployment. And Glasgow Green was raised up 2 feet above the ground. When the government was ready to mobilise, it just employed everyone. And that's a really clear example of the ability of the government to make sure that everyone can be employed.
So can I ask, with regards to the job guarantee in Scotland, is there plans to maybe, make it part of a Green New Deal for Scotland? And I guess this is kind of related to what are Scotland's economic priorities as newly independent country? Is there a lot of its, for example, energy source that still comes from oil, or has it transitioned towards wind farms?
We are massive on renewable energy. Scotland has 25% of the tidal renewable energy of the EU. Not of the UK, of the EU. We have 25% of the offshore wind of the EU. You'll have noticed that also we have been drilling oil out of the ground since the late 1960s as well. But unfortunately, unlike Norway, we have not benefited from that to the same degree that the Norwegians have. That money was really used to make a lot of people in Scotland unemployed. And, the results of that were really obvious to me as a teenager and as an adult. So this is probably also another reason why I feel really passionate about this idea, because there was a lot of unemployment created through Thatcher, and it's been very toxic for Scotland. And if you've read The Spirit Level, you understand why that toxicity is.
So energy is a big priority.
We created about 97% of our energy from new renewables last year. We are a net exporter of energy to the rest of the UK. And we have been for a long time. We have been since the days that we've been, since we used water for energy, the hydroelectric.
Because in my head, I'll tell you what my mindset is at the moment, is all this idea of independence is very much attached to sovereignty, and obviously currency is a big important part of it. So we are told energy and things like maybe food sovereignty.
We're massively food sovereign.
Oh, okay. So no issues there either.
No, I mean, I discussed this with Fidel today. We have 60% of the UK's fishing waters.
So I guess the better question is England going to be able to feed itself after Scotland leaves?
Well, you'll be able to buy things from it.
Build up those foreign reserves.
But yeah, no, I mean, Scotland, it's an advanced economy, the same as England is as well. So, but we are very, very lucky with resources. And we, at the time of the Act of Union, we were 20% of the UK's population, and we are now only 8.3% of the UK's population. So the UK is the most unequal country in the EU. All the infrastructure, really was concentrated down in London. And then, of course, with all the government infrastructure being concentrated in one city, that means that everyone wants to live in that city, and everyone wants to get in about the power that's contained within those government structures. And for example, in Germany, they have lots of their ministries spread all over the country, and they do in the US as well. But Britain's unusual in the way that it runs the country as well, and there are a whole load of historical reasons for why that is. But it's created massive inequality, and you'll see that there is an independence movement growing in Wales just now, because obviously with the pandemic, the Welsh could see that they just weren't really being cared about by Westminster. And I think also the people in Northern England felt the same way too. And also our electoral system. Yeah, our electoral system, the first past the post system, contributes to that problem. Unfortunately, when the Lib Dems came in with the Conservatives, they did try and make a move to change the electoral system slightly, but it's not been changed. And it's the whole thing of the politics is just not helping to increase democracy across the whole of the UK.
Sometimes you hear mostly bad faith actors say that England subsidizes Scotland, and I think that has to do with the Barnet formula. Obviously, that's wrong, but can you explain a little bit why they're wrong and what the Barnet formula is about?
So essentially the Barnet formula is a kind of calculation as to how much would be spent in Scotland in mirroring effect to what would spend in the rest of the UK. So, for example, if the Tory government decided one day to miraculously invest, a 20% increase in the NHS, which they'd never do, of course, in a million years, but for the sake of argument, let's pretend they do, what Scotland's percentage of that, which would be, I think it's roughly proportional between 8 to 10%, would also get that increase too. And these are called Barnet consequentials, essentially. So if England gets an increase in spending, then that spending, therefore, is reflective of what Scotland would get as a share of that as well. Although there's also debate around that as well, because sometimes there are certain areas of spending in England which could there not create Barnet consequentials. So I'm pretty sure the DUP deal, for example, when Theresa May got a majority of the DUP, when they invested those extra billions in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland didn't get any of that. So obviously it's a far more political tool, because obviously you can try and bribe certain parties for that extra investment. In fact, Boris Johnson recently talked about trying to spend, a wave of spending for Scotland on education, and to try and kind of take on the SNP before the election. Now, overall, as you pointed out though yourself, Patricia, this isn't really subsidising. No part of the UK is really subsidised from an accounting perspective. Spending just literally originates from the Consolidation Fund, which begins in London. The question is, where is the kind of financial priority being put into? And you can recognise that by which parts of the UK are producing the greatest amount of production overall, and that can be recognised through regional surpluses. So when you look at regional surpluses, it's heavily focused down on the southeast of England and just the south of England as a whole. One thing worth pointing out, I think is worth acknowledging as well, is we always talk about how the regional inequality between Scotland and the southeast of England, the south of England. I think actually there was an academic paper I read a couple of months ago actually that labelled this sort of UK growth model as one of the most unequal regional models in the developed world. I'll try and get off that paper and just bring up what they say in it. But they make the point that actually it's not just Scotland and southeast of England, it's actually everyone and the southeast of England, because that is, well, you could argue that for politically speaking, that's where the Tory vote is. That is where the investment is largely going. And that's where they're kind of creating that mass appeal to voters. So if that's the kind of spending focus you're creating, then why would the Conservatives give a shit about any other part of the UK which is seeing this regional inequality in the first place? So this is a sort of wider political challenge in which not just Scotland, but all parts of the UK have to face. The question is, what opportunities do we have to try and tackle that? And from a Scottish perspective, you have Scottish Independence. From the Northern perspective, you have Labour of the Red Wall, or if you want to, go to the Northern Independence Party. And from a Welsh perspective, you have Plaid Cymru. Or you can go for the federalist issue, which my personal opinion is a dead duck. The federalist conversation is not going really anywhere. But if you want to pursue that, that is an option you can go and pursue. So the Barnet formula exists to kind of create a mirroring effect, but it can largely be quite political if used in the wrong way. Conservatives.
I wanted to ask, how was, the whole currency issue collide in some way with potential membership to the EU, and I'm pretty sure even in the SNP there are people advocating for the euro, unless I'm wrong about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are. But fundamentally, that's a long way down the road. I mean, first of all, we have to get independence. So, we've got an election on Thursday. And then it pretty much looks like the SNP are going to sweep the board, and the independence parties are going to be dominant, and we're going to then ask for a Section 30, and then we're going to see what happens from there. If we don't get a Section 30, then we'll probably end up going to the courts.
Sorry, can you just say what the Section 30 is, just for...
Oh, right, okay, so the Section 30 is to allow Scotland to have its own referendum. Just even saying that to you is just riles me.
I already know what the UK government is going to do as well. Like, I can see exactly what's going to happen. They're going to say
well,
no.
we have an incredibly right-wing government, and so we'll just have to see what happens. And I mean, once we get the referendum, that will happen eventually, because you can't hold democracy back, once we get the referendum and then we win the referendum, which we will, because even the demographics without campaigning say that we'll win this referendum, because the young people want it and the old people who don't want it are to be frank, they're dying off. So, we will win this referendum. When we win this referendum, then voting on the EU would be another referendum. So, you're probably going to be a few years down the line inside your first parliament before you're even going to think about that. The SNP position is that they want to rejoin Europe. Where they want to join the Eurozone is a different matter.
That's what I was going to ask about.
Well, obviously, the UK wasn't in the Eurozone. And this is the thing that we see our politicians being asked all the time by the mainstream media is, well, you'll have to join the Eurozone, so you'll be joining another currency union. And it's, well, you didn't.
And also taking advice from Westminster. It's like, that'll be in good faith, won't it? I will definitely.
Exactly.
You people who don't want us to have independence, I will definitely take your advice.
Yeah, well, we're talking about the people that are in power just now. I mean, obviously, it's not full of nefarious actors. There are lots of really good people in there as well, but unfortunately, the bad people got put into power.
Yeah. One of the issues of the kind of the Euro, well, first of all, on the Euro discussion, it's not that, it's, as Kairin already pointed out, it's heavily unpopular in Scotland. Only 18%. According to most, roughly 18% to 20% of Scots back the euro. So if even if unorthodox kind of economists or kind of essential politicians argue that that a new Scottish currency is unpopular, it's going to be even harder to sell the euro. And I think even like Scottish EU commentators such as like Anthony Salmoni, he's managing director of European Merchants in Scotland. He even made the argument himself, saying, if anything's going to happen, it's probably going to be a Scottish currency to go forward. But you're right, Patricia, you're right. This ultimately comes down to real politics, essentially. And whilst you have varying different criteria programs to follow, these rules are broken all the time. Germany and France especially have broken their own deficit criteria a ton, and yet they've actually allowed themselves to get away with any sort of EU central bank fines. Whereas, on the other hand, if you Greece or Italy, then it's a no. If you break the rule, you're going to get fined. To be more specific, there are two programs within the EU which kind of touch on kind of European policy. So for countries that have the euro, they have the stability program, which kind of touches on the kind of process of what happens if you're in the euro and you breach the 3% deficit rule or the 50% debt rule. And whereas if you don't have your own currency, such as Sweden, the UK, or Denmark, then we're talking about a convergence program pack. Now, within the stability program, if you continuously breach those rules, the European Central Bank will essentially fine you, or will reconsider giving any sort of European euro loans to you in the future, because obviously your nations actually are within the framework of having to actually borrow in real terms. That's a real terms consequence, and that's losing real monetary power and real political power, essentially, of how you can shape your own economy. Whereas when it comes to the Convergence Program, which I think is Article 126 of the criteria, I cannot remember, I could be wrong there, but please forgive me if I'm wrong. Essentially what happens there is that the Council of Economic and Finance Ministers, they will basically review your own macro stability, but they can't give you a fine, but they'll basically kind of shake their head at you and give you a disgruntled warning of don't do it again, which of course, as a fund. Yeah, they send you letters, but it's the euro. But you're right, the euro is a hard one. I think I largely take kind of Dirk Ent's position on this, where I am very critical of the structural, monetary, and political overall structures of the European Union. I ultimately think that it needs massive reforms overall. And there is a large agreement that is Eurosceptical, but at the same time, its overall goal I can massively appreciate. And I've kind of grown up with a lot of friends who I've met, for example, freedom of movement, which I think has actually overall been a massive benefit to my local area, and meeting so many friends from different communities and building these connections. And you could arguably say it's one of the more positive aspects of globalization, even though it's not benefited everyone equally. So the truth is I'm torn. That is the ultimate truth. I am ultimately torn on how I feel towards Europe. Overall, I'm more positive because I've had that more personal experience, but I'd be lying to myself if I said there weren't issues with it in terms of the structural makeup of the political, economic aspects of Europe. I'm torn both ways, but overall, I'm more positive towards it because I believe it can do some good. If there was a situation, if it came to the case where Scotland was forced to adopt the euro, which I don't believe will happen. I don't believe that is the kind of nature of the European Union. But if it ultimately said you have to take on the euro, I would ultimately be in favour of not joining the EU. But I don't believe that is the outcome we will reach. I think there will be some sort of real politics at play here, but who knows? Scotland's journey in the EU is quite a long one. There's different discussions of what Scotland's role will be in Europe. Will it be a proactive member? Will it be more of a domestic member focusing on the kind of at-heart issues? Will it be more of an internationalist beyond the EU, maybe talking about climate change? These are really big discussions that need to happen. And to be honest, it kind of goes beyond politics, and that's where kind of communities really need to take charge on that issue. So my honest answer is, I'm a confused teddy bear. There's some things I have mixed feelings about, but it comes down to real politics in the end, a lot of the discussion.
Can I also say the other thing that I think especially people in the South don't realise is that we're right up on the edge of the Arctic Circle, and we have really good relationships with the people in the other countries around that area as well, and that's really strategically important for Scotland as well going forward. As you know, I have a funny surname, Van Sweeden. I married a Dutchman. I moved to the Netherlands and I met my husband about a year after I moved there. They switched to the euro while I lived there. So when I lived there, they started with the gulden. And I worked in the care sector for a while, and I realised when I was in the care sector that once I started to understand what people were saying a lot more, was that they were losing their healthcare system. It was being privatised slowly. And I sort of looked up from a discussion about it, and I said to them, what, you're allowing your healthcare system to be privatised? And they sort of looked downwards in shame. And I said, why weren't you protesting on the streets about this? So I could see at that time that neoliberalism was creeping in there. And then also what I noticed, I still listen to Dutch podcasts as well to keep up with the news in the Netherlands as well. And what I really notice is this kind of slightly superior attitude towards the southern countries. It's a little bit like the reverse of what we've got in the UK, where the Dutch people are looking at the people in Greece and going, oh, they just don't work very hard, do they? and we're the really hardworking people up here, and we're the ones that's just doing everything, and they're just profligate down there. In the meantime, the Netherlands is a huge tax haven, and the people who've got money in Greece and Spain and Italy are hiding their money in the tax havens contained within the Netherlands. So again, a lot of people, my friends, they've got no idea about this, but that's what is going on there. So it's interesting to see it, and also when learning about the currency as well. I'm less sort of naive about all of that now than I was before. We don't need to have involuntary unemployment in Scotland, in an independent Scotland, in anywhere in the UK with a free-floating fiat currency. This is what we're really trying to get across on the paper. It's so much healthier if we take the precarity out of our society. The other thing that I've been talking about to people is, why are we saving and why are people buying up houses? It's the feeling of precarity that this neoliberalism has created over the past 40 years of most of my adult life. And, let's try and stop the precarity and the feeling of precarity, and let's start. We have an advanced economy. It shouldn't be like this.
To add on to that as well, I think one of my favorite parts was the last part of the paper, one of the last parts of the paper, which was the conceptual projects part. I feel like for me, so in our paper, I think, and this is something Karen and one of our colleagues, Craig Berry, really stressed on, was what does it actually mean, having a job guarantee? What can it actually translate to? So at the end of the paper, we discussed various kind of projects which could be done. It's worth pointing out, though, that a lot of these projects we believe could actually be done through public projects by the central government or even by local government. But if in place they're not done by these governments, then the job guarantee is, because it's locally delivered, can be a project carried out by community councils or by local communities as a whole. And that's what for example, we could do. We touched on at the very beginning of the conceptual project was Land of Trees. And this takes kind of the concept from Val McDermid's book, which is called Imagine a Country, in which one of the chapters touches on creating a pine tree forest in Glasgow, creating 800,000 trees, which is about trying to, reduce anxiety amongst all different graphics, increasingly better mental health for all, and also by improving greener cities and increasing leisure activities. And when you talk about that, you don't automatically think macroeconomics and price stability and buffer stock mechanisms or these kind of bubbles. You talk about just having a really imagined vision about what your local area can look like. And we also try to touch on, and one of them was a nation of art. So trying to create a new arts project about trying to reflect what would a new Scottish independent Scotland look like? What is the reflection of our arts sector going to look like? What can it build towards reorganizing the image of our country as it joins the international stage? And then we also touched on rewilding the Highlands, because there's a lot of areas actually which have been heavily rejected by central government that need that regeneration programs. And part of that comes down to, purchasing up land to try and put productive use. A lot of that comes down to just trying to reduce the brain drain and really investing in local areas there. At one point, fun side story, when we were originally doing this paper, I came across the concept of rewilding Scotland's Highlands with wolves. And my first thought was, whoa, this sounds cool, having wolves in the Highlands. And then I met the kind of repopulation people within the community who went, no, Cameron, shut up. People come first. So I then completely flipped, because actually the important thing was, whilst having wolves might sound cool as a project and trying to rewild the Highlands, you have to remember it's about people. You have to remember these people are actually real people in the Highlands and Islands. They need to come first and have projects which will affect them in a beneficial way. So I actually learned a lesson, which was, when creating this paper, you might have this really cool sort of maybe middle class concepts of what a job guarantee program can create, but you have to have people at the heart of it. Otherwise, what's really the point of having a job guarantee program at all?
So the other thing that I'd really like to put across to both of you as well, and you're maybe not aware of it, is how poor our local democracy is in Scotland. And actually it's worse than it is in England. And England is not particularly good when you compare with the countries that are next door to us, like France and Norway and places like that. So, for example, where I live just now, you have Aberdeen Local Authority, where I am. We have one councillor for every 4,743 residents. And you compare that with England, and the average there is 2,814 residents per one councillor. In Norway, it's 572 residents per councillor.
Wow, yeah.
So the when people say to you there's too much there are too many politicians, no, that's not the case. And the thing with Norway is that they have a much higher turnouts in both types of elections, local elections and national elections. People are getting a kick of the ball in Norway, which they are not getting. Our local democracy is just absolutely shocking. So it's not just that I want to see Scotland be in control of what happens in Scotland. I want to see power devolve down even further to local communities. And what Cameron and I believe is that the job guarantee could be instrumental in doing that. Our vision of it is that it will be controlled by local community councils, and that they will make a decision about what's required in their area, and the central government will provide the money.
And yeah, Kairin, you're also Northeast Coordinator for the SNP Commonweal Group.
Yeah.
And can you tell us about their work?
So before I go back to Commonweal, I just want to let you know, Leith, where I used to live, has one councillor per 8,069 people. So, this is how impoverished our democracy is. But Commonweal are another think tank, and they are very progressive, they're very green, and they've done a huge amount of work. They started working before the referendum, and their policies very, very leftish, very green. And basically, there's a lot of people in the SNP really like their research. So we decided to form a group to say, okay, people who are interested in this type of policy, maybe we can get together as a group and work on resolutions for each conference, so that, in every branch, you've got, different types of people, that we reach out to different branches and say, right, if you're that kind of lefty, greeny person, then perhaps you want to be in this group, and we can work on policy together. And that's really the thinking behind it, is that, you're working with people across Scotland who have the same kind of interests that you do.
I just got, weirdly enough, I think it's good to bring this up. I have a message from my friend Jack just now, who just asked me a question. He's just sent me like a graph being created by obviously a political opponent. And it's making the argument here in relation to a new Scottish currency. I thought maybe worth touching on it because of just the kind of nature of a modern fiat currency. So he's pointing out that in relation to a new Scottish currency, banks, because as we know, most currency is actually created by private banks, or as MMTs will point out, they're agents of the state effectively. And that because in an independent Scotland, because all these banks will create new Scottish currency on demand, it actually acts against the currency, because you have surplus currency in circulation and will actually depreciate the currency. So I think there's three main points touching on this. And I think whilst we understand the supply of a new currency is effectively infinite, I think a lot of people ignore the demand side of launching a new currency. And just for anyone listening, if you're other countries using the euro, this also applies to yourself, because if you're launching a currency, you'll get this argument of infinite supply could lead to depreciation, but that doesn't include the assessment of demand. So here's why, essentially, when it comes to looking at the private end of the new currency, here's why there would not be a massive infinite supply, which would actually help because it creates an appreciating effect. So first of all, when it comes to companies, especially more kind of cautious ones, they're most likely going to probably convert their current UK sterling currency into new Scottish currency to settle current liabilities, rather than just swapping that liability for bank loan. Because if you think about it, the launch of a new Scottish currency, there won't be an immediate enough Scottish currency revenue going around right away to cover any loans that will have to be repaid at the time. So what you'll end up doing probably is you'll end up having to convert a new UK currency anyway, and you'd ultimately lose revenue from the interest given from that. So the most likelihood is you're going to have to probably convert a new Scottish currency from your sterling assets, unless you want to lose from interest you're getting from bank loans from that, which wouldn't make much sense. Second reason being that I think ultimately companies will prioritise using the Scottish pound anyway to settle their pound liabilities before trying to pay for imports and to send out any other surplus currency to get out to their parent companies, because they essentially want to kind of keep that form of profit ultimately in the end. And the third reason being the amount of actual Scottish currency companies and people get depends on nature. We will ultimately have quite enthusiastic adopters of the Scottish currency who will convert their current sterling that they have to more than they actually need. But you're also going to get more cautious companies and more people who, at a minimum, will only swap or take out loans to the size of their current Scottish currency liabilities, which at first will be small, because at the beginning of a new Scottish currency, the first thing we're probably going to be doing is just focusing on liabilities from tax. That is a tax you have to pay to the government or local government. But this will grow in pace as well when it comes to transition, because you'll be talking about wages and talking about rent too. So this, therefore, ultimately actually matches that kind of growing transition. And what is worth pointing out is that when you pay your taxes, as modern money points out, the money pays off the national debt and is essentially destroyed. So does paying off loans destroys money as well. It used to pay for that loan paid off effectively. So the more Scottish currency is put into the economy, the more that's also essentially cancelled out when you were paying for mortgages or paying for private debt. And of course, this obviously mirrors each other pretty well. So at the end of the day, when we're talking about an assessment of how a new Scottish currency comes forward, ultimately, I don't think we're going to see a massive demand because we want the opt-in sort of attitude. And we're talking about a currency that's about faith, and that faith will increase over time because an opt-in sort of model, the scale of creating that sort of balance towards, opting for the new Scottish currency in line against the sterling currency.
I have actually a very important question that I don't understand why I haven't asked this before, but is it going to be called the kilt?
That's it.
And my preference would be the Scottish krona. That would be my preference.
Yes.
I think I would like it. I would like to align ourselves with our Scandinavian neighbours. And but I think Tim had said we used to have a currency, the mark.
The mark.
It's the mark.
Yeah, I'm actually with you in this one, Kieran. I think having the krona is a very good idea. I think it's just, if we want to go for the more kind of Nordic Scandinavian models of social democracy, or even if we want to go further for socialism, then I think krona is a good starting point there. And also just, it's just nice. I like krona, 5 kronas, 10 kronas. I don't know, just has a nice ring to it, I guess. But you know what? If you want to go for the kilt, you can lobby the new central bank when it's formed in a few years' time.
We'll have a competition.
You'll end up being called Poundy McPoundface.
That's actually one important point. So the names are going to have funny ideas, but I think one point which Commonweal actually touched on as well was the design of the currency is actually quite important. I mean, it's not important in macro terms, obviously, but what you put on the currency in terms of the faces, the symbols, is actually important because it represents what the values of your country represent. Now, right now, of course, we have a lot of maybe famous academics, but we also have a lot of the monarchy on it, for example. And maybe some would argue that the current UK pound represents kind of the establishment of the kind of monarchical, potentially patriarchal, and also the kind of establishment of the last 300 years. Whereas imagine if you can put, say, for example, we talked about the original creator of the job guarantee, Sadie Alexander. Well, imagine we had her on the currency, or what if we had like Rosa Luxemburg on the currency, or imagine we had like some fantastic people from ethnic minorities, maybe some fantastic women, fantastic progressive through history that have really pushed forward the ambition of humanity forward onto our currency to show that, if as a new formal state of Scotland, this is who we are. These are the people we value and the contributions they have made to humanity. And here are the sort of suggestions that we want to go forward as a society. I think that's a good chance to really reshape, with the job guarantee and local projects, it's a great opportunity to reshape what kind of country we want to be. And you don't need independence for that. You can do that right now for our own currency and reassess who do we want in our currency and why, and what does it represent as a nation, and what does it represent for our local communities.
What would you like listeners to do, having heard this, if they want to get involved and push this thing along?
Yeah, for people in England, you fight for the National Health Service. If you're not a member of the Labour Party and you're a socialist, then get in there and make it more socialist, because it has moved to the right. We've seen that, and don't abandon it. Just get in there and make it more left wing. And for people in Scotland, the same thing. If you're not in a political party, get involved in politics. And you're never going to be happy exactly with what your party says, but you can get inside the party. And if you have strong beliefs, then bring them forth and try and change the party.
I think one thing I'll point out is when me and Kieran call, we always say to each other, "Oh, it's great we can have this conversation," because it's always hard to have it with other people. But actually, if you're listening right now and you feel like you're struggling to have this conversation, don't be scared. Go for it. Have a conversation. Really reach out to people who you think won't care but actually do care. Tell them about deficits. Tell them about the national debt. Tell them that the money in their pocket actually means something. It isn't finite. Tell them that tell them the conversations you hear in this podcast. If you're scared right now, stand up, take a breath, get on your computer, message your gran and tell her about MMT. Just go for it. Just absolutely go for it. Because the minute we all take a bit of responsibility of going forward with this, change will happen faster. So just, you have what, if you're listening now, you have what it takes, go for it.
And it is literally about saving lives.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thanks very much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.
Section 30 is to allow Scotland to have its own referendum. Just even saying that to you is just riles me.
Guys, I'm sorry about everything.
I know. It's not your fault.